service you can go to. You can go to askjan.org. That's askjan.org. There you will find a great wealth of information. Everything from information based on type of impairment, the type of limitation, various topics. We have a great section called A to Z where you can kind of look for general information there. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't mean that if you don't find what you're looking for there that we can't talk to you about a particular situation, but it's a good place to start. We offer a lot of publications, articles, resources that you can take advantage of, all for free. We have areas of this site that are devoted to individuals with disabilities, to employers, to rehabilitation professionals, and others as well. There's also an ADA library, so if you're looking for information regarding the regulations and requirements, the information is right there on the JAN site. For those of you who are interested in training or providing training, we also offer different types of training that you can access in real time or request customized training like this type of training today. And of course, we have a quarterly e-news and blogs, other ways that we distribute information that might be of interest to you on a regular basis. So the bottom line is askjan.org is here for you. It is a service that you can take advantage of. It's entirely free of charge, and it is available to anyone who has questions about accommodations or the ADA. So I encourage you all to give it a try. Next slide. And just so you know, the contact information for the service is at the end of the PowerPoint, and I'll go ahead and mention that, of course, at the end as well, and kind of tell you a little bit more about how you can access the service then. So as we sort of start thinking more about disability and work, for those of you who might be considering looking for work or who are in a job and maybe you're not sure exactly how your disability affects how you could do the work, it's important to kind of understand that a little bit. So when you're thinking about accommodation or you're thinking about disclosure, you want to know if, and if so, how your disability might impact the work that you either do or are interested in doing. This can help you then figure out how you might go about requesting accommodation and perhaps what those accommodations might be once you're on the job. It's also important to know about the ADA and how to request accommodations related to working. So the best thing that you can do as an individual with a disability is to understand what your rights are under the federal ADA. For those who might be rehabilitation professionals, you want to be prepared to empower those clients or customers that you're working with so that they have the information they need in order to be educated on the law and what their rights are as well. And also, you want to also be able to work with employers too. Or if you're an employer listening today, you want to know about what your responsibilities are. So having at least a basic understanding of the law can be extremely helpful in these types of situations. You also want to know how to access resources that can support the interactive accommodation process. So that process I mentioned earlier, you want to know who can help it along the way. So whether you're working with a vocational rehabilitation counselor, whether you're wanting to reach out to resources like JAN that can help support that process, it's important to know what your resources are. So, and JAN can help with that too. So certainly know that we're available as a resource to you. Next slide. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit about the ADA, and this is just going to be a basic primer. This is not going to be an in-depth discussion of the law, but it's important to sort of establish that foundation for what the ADA is. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I, which is the part of the law that relates to employment situations. It's a federal civil rights statute that removes barriers to equal employment for individuals with disabilities. So basically it's intended to sort of level the playing field and to make sure that people with disabilities have an equal opportunity to be considered for a job, to be promoted at work, to continue to perform job duties. The law was amended back in 2008. You've probably heard the term ADA Amendments Act. The most important thing to probably know about the ADA Amendments Act is that it didn't change the ADA. What it did do is it changed the way we interpret some of the words used in the law. So for example, the definition of disability. It kind of changed the way we look at the definition of disability. The main intention being to make it so that more people with disabilities can seek coverage under the law, because prior to the act, the ADA was a bit more restrictive, or was interpreted in a more restrictive way. So that's the main change that you would see there. The ADA applies to covered entity employers. So these are employers that are private sector employers that employ 15 or more people. It can be state or local government employers, regardless of the number of employees, employment agencies, labor unions as well. So for the most part, they're going to be employers that you are working with that employ 15 or more people in the private sector, or state and local government entities. Next slide. Now, what's important to know about Title I is that it does prohibit disability-based discrimination in all employment practices and during all stages of the employment process. So I say from hiring to retiring. So, from the point of applying for a job to when you're on the job, to maybe you've been on the job for 6 months, 6 years, or 20 years. The ADA is going to apply all along the way. And when I say prohibits disability-based discrimination, that means that any time an employer makes a decision or chooses to deny an employment opportunity, for example, on the basis that somebody has a disability or medical condition, that's the type of discrimination that the ADA prohibits. It also requires reasonable accommodations. So one of the statutory requirements is that employers provide reasonable accommodations when it's known that those accommodations are needed, and also when it is reasonable to do so, and when it doesn't create an undue hardship. So employers are only expected to provide accommodations that are considered to be reasonable, ones that will not create an undue hardship for the employer in some way. So undue hardship is something like significant difficulty or expense, for example. Also, it requires, that employers just, keep these things in mind when you're talking about the hiring process, or once an individual's on the job. So so throughout the PowerPoint, you'll see that there are a few resources listed here that are starred. So for example, your employment rights as an individual with a disability is a resource that you can use that talks about the ADA. And so you can access that. And there's a link at the end of the PowerPoint too. Next slide. Who can request or receive a job accommodation? So if somebody is a job applicant who might need an accommodation to participate in the hiring process, this is something that an individual can do. If you are an individual who has an actual or a record of an ADA disability. So what does that mean? So that means that you're somebody who has an impairment, a physical or mental impairment that's substantially limiting in some way at the current time, or you have a record of such an impairment. So that you're somebody who perhaps has a history, let's say of cancer, for example, and at one time you had some significant limitations resulting from that cancer, then you may be a person with a disability who can receive accommodations. You have to be an individual who's qualified. So an individual with a disability who is qualified is somebody who meets the job's general requirements, is somebody who's able to perform all of the essential job duties with or without accommodation. So at the end of the day, can you get the job done? Can you perform all of what would be considered the essential duties of that position is what you're looking at. And also, do you have the skills, the talents, the certifications, the training, the education, all of those things that make an individual qualified. So you must be qualified. For information related to the topic of the definition of disability and determining who has a disability, there is a resource for that as well. It's on the JAN website. So that's a starred resource here that you'll find at the end of the PowerPoint as well. Next slide. What's meant by reasonable accommodation? So reasonable is kind of a legal term, and basically it's something that can be determined really only by the employer. It's not something that anyone else can make a decision on. But an accommodation is a change or an adjustment to a job or the work environment that permits an applicant or an employee with a disability to do things like participate in the hiring process, or to perform what would be considered the essential duties of the job, or also to access benefits and privileges of employment. So it's about making sure that a person with a disability has equal access to all aspects of the employment process. Reasonable does mean feasible or plausible. Think of it as something that's possible to provide without it creating an undue hardship for the employer. An undue hardship, again, is an action that is requiring significant difficulty or expense. So something that's really, really difficult for the employer to provide. Sometimes it's based on cost, although we tell employers to avoid making a cost undue hardship claim because that can be extremely difficult. But it could be that the accommodation is disruptive in some way. Next slide. Now, there's no comprehensive list of accommodations that are reasonable under the ADA. It's something that you have to look at on a case by case basis. Yes, we can look at might be feasible or plausible, but there's not a list of accommodations that employers must provide that are considered to be reasonable. Ultimately, it is up to the employer to decide what's considered reasonable, and they do have the right to choose among effective accommodation solutions. So what that means is if, let's say, there are two types of accommodations, both are reasonable, both are effective, the employer has the right to choose among those accommodations. Although it is said that the preference of the individual with a disability should be given primary consideration when it's possible to do so. So if you know of a particular accommodation that you think will be better than another, then it's important for you to let the employer know that so that they can keep that into consideration when they're making their decision about what accommodations provided. Some things to keep in mind in terms of what is not reasonable. Employers are not required to remove what would be considered essential job functions. They're also not required to provide personal use items. So these are things like prescribed items. Think of something like a hearing aid or a wheelchair, for example. They're also not required to lower or disregard production standards and performance standards. So if they have standards of this kind, then the employer can expect that all people and people with disabilities as well meet those standards. Sometimes an accommodation might be needed to enable the person to meet the standard, but the employer doesn't have to lower those standards or disregard them in any way. Employers are also not required to create new jobs as a reasonable accommodation. So that means that if an individual can't perform the job they're in any longer, there's no accommodation to enable that. Let's say there isn't another vacant position they could be moved to, an employer doesn't have to just create a job in order to keep that person working. But of course, while all of these things might not be reasonable, they might not be required under the ADA, an employer can always go above and beyond to do these types of things if they wish to do so. So even though it might not be something they have to do, sometimes employers are willing to go above and beyond to make modifications in order to keep somebody working. Next slide. Now, there are three categories of reasonable accommodation. Generally, these fall into things like modifications or adjustments needed during the hiring process. So, for example, maybe an interpreter for an interview, maybe getting interview questions in advance if that's feasible, making sure that the interview location is accessible, things like that. It could also be the category of modifications or adjustments to the work environment or to the manner in which the work is performed. So, to the work environment, we're thinking about usually access issues. In terms of performing the job duties, it might mean making adjustments to how certain functions are performed, when they're performed, what equipment might be used in order to perform those functions, things like that. And then the third category is modifications or adjustments to enable someone to access benefits or privileges of employment. You might think of things like parking. Parking is actually something that's considered a benefit or a privilege of employment. It's not something that's always available to people. So it's something that where someone might need an accommodation in order to access parking. Next slide. These are just some examples of accommodations. This sort of falls among a list of those provided by the enforcement agency of the ADI, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So it could be things like making existing facilities accessible and usable, job restructuring where you take away marginal job duties or change how an essential duty is performed. Flexible and modified work schedules, pretty common. Acquiring or modifying equipment, sometimes it might be necessary to provide things like software that somebody might use to access their computer screen, for example. Modifying policies can come up, so that might be where you're modifying, let's say, an attendance policy. It could be a telework policy. It could be a dress code of some kind. So lots of things can fall into policy modifications. It could be services like a qualified reader or interpreter or a job coach that might be needed on the job. It can also be things like reassignment to a vacant position. So if for some reason somebody is not able to perform the job that they're in, if there is an alternative vacancy they're qualified for, that can be looked at as a possible solution. Working remotely is pretty common right now. A lot of people are doing that. Some because the employers send everybody home and it's not an accommodation in that case, but some who are at home because they can't be in the work environment for a medical reason. And then also things like service or emotional support animals could also come into play as well, and leave when it makes sense to provide leave in order for someone to manage their medical situation to come back to work, basically. Next slide. Now, I'm going to throw out just a quick little situation here to kind of illustrate things. Tasha works in a call center providing customer service. She has vision loss that's progressive, and she's experiencing some difficulty reading the computer screen. She's worried about losing her job. So, this is a situation where when you're thinking about, I have a disability, I know it's affecting my work performance. Is it time for me to maybe tell my employer about that? Should I disclose that to the employer and maybe request accommodation? In this case, Tasha goes ahead and decides to talk to her manager about the vision loss and how that's affecting her job performance. And together they go to Human Resources to talk about exploring technology related accommodations like screen reading and magnification software and a larger monitor. So she made the decision that it made sense to disclose so that she could receive an accommodation that would enable her to perform her essential job duties. Next slide. So, what are the big takeaways with this first section here? What are your rights as an employee with a disability? So, it's important that you know that you can expect to be treated fairly and given an equal opportunity at work. That you not be discriminated against at work because of a disability related reason, and to receive a job accommodation that's reasonable when you know that it's needed, when you make it known to the employer that it's needed, and when you go through that interactive process to figure out what accommodations might be reasonable and effective. So knowing your rights is about knowing what the law requires in terms of non-discrimination, reasonable accommodation, and so it's important to kind of take that away from this segment. Next slide. Now let's talk about disclosure. So disability disclosure is very personal. It's something that you have to decide when it's right for you. And it's not always necessary. You have to really kind of consider the circumstances and whether it's something that you want to talk to the employer about. So deciding if and when and how to disclose disability related information, it's something that really boils down to the circumstances and your individual circumstances to figure out what's right for you. Why would you disclose? Well, usually it's to request an accommodation to participate in that hiring process or to perform essential job duties or to access benefits and privileges of employment. So that's typically what we see. So, for example, if you have a disability that's not apparent, the employer doesn't know about it, you might not have any reason to disclose that information. You could if you choose to, but usually it's because you would want to receive an accommodation at work. Another reason that disclosure comes into play is when somebody might need to explain an unusual circumstance. And probably the best example of that is when a disability is affecting somebody's performance or conduct in the work environment, and the employer doesn't know about it. They don't have reason to understand that there's an impact on performance because of a disability related reason. So that's when it's a good time to disclose your disability and talk about possible reasonable accommodations so that you can meet the performance and conduct standard requirements. Next slide. Here's another situation. Charmaine has epilepsy and is taking a new medication that makes it difficult to wake up in the morning. She was late for work 3 times in the past week. Charmaine had not disclosed her disability, but believes that a flexible schedule could help her meet attendance requirements. So a solution in this case would be thinking about disclosure and going to the employer to see about accommodation. So Charmaine decides to disclose that she has epilepsy and requests to flex her work schedule as needed. The employer is willing to do this. The employer agrees that as long as she gets her time in between the core business hours, so for example, between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., that the employer is able to work with her on this accommodation so that she has some flexibility. Now, that doesn't mean the employer has to completely disregard time and attendance, but there would be some parameters around this type of accommodation. So when she comes in, if she has to come in late, that she would need to make up that time later in the day. So, so there would be other factors to consider in that process, but that just sort of shows that, when there's a performance situation or an attendance policy, for example, that's being impacted, it might be a good time to talk to the employer about your disability to figure out whether or not accommodations could come into play. Next slide. Now, there are some tips to consider with disability disclosure. One is don't disclose too soon. So, as I mentioned earlier, if you do have a disability that's not apparent, but it's not affecting your ability to do the job, and there's no reason to discuss disability or request accommodation, there's no reason to disclose or talk to the employer about that. However, on the flip side of that, you don't want to disclose too late either. So if you don't want to end up in a situation where performance is suffering, or you violated a conduct rule and it's disability related in some way, and now all of a sudden you're being counseled for your performance or you're close to being terminated, you don't want to wait that long. So do disclose information before performance or conduct suffer. Know what to disclose. So basically, you want to be able to share that you have an impairment or medical condition, a disability, and that you're needing an adjustment at work for a reason related to that. And the limitations that you're experiencing. So you want to be able to disclose enough information so the employer knows that you're asking for an accommodation. You're trying to leverage your rights under the ADA. You also want to know whom to disclose and request accommodation from. So if it's a hiring process and you're working with a recruiter, then you might tell them. It might be the hiring manager that you would talk to. If, on the other hand, you're on the job, then maybe you're talking to a manager or supervisor, or going directly to human resources. That could also be another route. So know who to go to. It's not going to be a colleague or a coworker. It's going to be somebody who can act on that request. Also, don't disclose to everyone. Yes, you have the right to talk about your disability and share information with others, but that can be personal. And so it's not the kind of thing where you necessarily need to disclose and talk to everyone in the work environment about it. You also don't need to tell other coworkers that you're receiving an accommodation if you are. That again is also personal. So don't feel as though you're compelled to have to share that information with everyone if you don't have any need to or desire to do so. Next slide. Now, generally, as it relates to the ADA, the obligation to request accommodation falls on the individual with a disability. So an employer is not expected to guess that you need an accommodation. They're only expected to provide accommodations when it is known the information is available to the employer to make those accommodations. But that duty falls on the individual to make that known to the employer. Disability disclosure and information about their impairment, the medical condition, it'll be necessary to receive an accommodation because you're trying to leverage your rights under the ADA. And in order to do that, you need to be able to establish that you do in fact have a disability. So you will need to share some information with the employer when the disability and or the need for accommodation isn't known or obvious. So that can come up. So usually when a request is made, you'll go ahead and get a request for information from the employer about your medical condition. Now, you are in California, so I also do want to note that under the Fair Employment and Housing Act, which is the California state statute, the rules are a little bit different in terms of what employers can ask for. So you do want to pay attention to that as well. So while the federal ADA allows employers to ask for information about your disability, even the diagnosis, the California statute's a little more restrictive. So employers technically in California shouldn't be asking you what the diagnosis is of your disability. They can ask about your limitations, how it affects your work, but they technically shouldn't be asking for information about the diagnosis. Also, accommodation requests can be made through, as I mentioned, a supervisor, manager, human resources, someone who can act on that request. So keep that in mind. An employer can initiate the interactive process when there's good reason to believe that an accommodation is needed if someone hasn't requested an impairment. So if the employer knows that you have an impairment and they know that they have good reason to believe that impairment, those limitations are affecting your performance, they can come to you and ask if an accommodation is needed. That doesn't happen very often, but sometimes it does when it's apparent to the employer that an accommodation might be needed. Next slide. Now, when it comes to disclosure, something to keep in mind is thinking about pre-employment and the kinds of things that can be asked during the pre-employment stage. So a lot of times applicants want to know whether they're required to applicants want to know whether they're required to disclose disability related information at a particular time. So whereas applicants don't need to share their disability related information and employers cannot outright ask about disability, there can be some limited exceptions to that process. So pre-employment. So generally employers can't require applicants to disclose disability related information prior to an offer of employment. So not until that post-offer phase of employment. But if somebody does request an accommodation for the hiring process, then an employer can ask about the disability. So for what reason are you requesting an accommodation for that hiring process? So that might be, if you need help with completing an online application or participating in a job interview or taking an employment test. In those types of situations, an employer can ask you questions about your disability. Next slide. Now, something to be aware of is something called voluntary self-identification of disability. This is different than disability disclosure. So voluntary self-identification is about voluntarily disclosing disability status, usually for affirmative action reasons. So some employers do practice affirmative action and actively seek and hire people with disabilities. And when that is the case, they will give you an opportunity to voluntarily self-identify your disability status. The most important thing to remember is this is entirely voluntary. It is not something you're required to do. So it is something that can be of benefit, but it isn't something you have to do if you don't wish to. You will see if you do apply for a job or if you work for a federal government contractor, so a private employer that has a federal government contract, they're required to ask this disability status during various stages of the employment process. So you might see a form, for example, or an online application where it asks you to check one of these boxes. So either to say you have a disability or a history or a record of, you can say that you don't have a disability if it's not something that you can report, or that you just simply don't wish to answer. So saying you don't wish to answer doesn't admit to having a disability or not having a disability. You're just choosing not to provide an answer at this time. But so the most important thing is it's entirely voluntary. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. So the big idea is the takeaways here with this segment related to disclosure is, what is disability disclosure and when should I do it? So disability disclosure is sharing that you have a disability and how it affects the way that you work or will affect the way that you work. Sharing this information with a manager or supervisor to request accommodation. So usually you're going to be disclosing that information with that type of person in the work environment. And usually you're doing it because you know you need a job accommodation. So some type of change at work for a reason related to your disability. So you might be having difficulty performing job duties or accessing a benefit or privilege because of a disability, or you might need accommodations also during those early stages of the hiring process as well. So disability disclosure is about sharing that information and going through that process of requesting accommodation through the appropriate person. Next slide. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the actual process of requesting accommodation. Starting that, what we call an interactive process, is one that begins with a request for accommodation. So a request for accommodation, it's when an applicant or an employee asks for an adjustment or a change at work for a reason related to their medical condition, related to their disability. So it's when you tell an employer what you think you need to help you do the job, basically. It can be just about anything. There are lots of ways that we make adjustments at work so that people can do their work. So think of an accommodation that way. It's just a change in how things are done. Jan offers several resources around this topic that I think would be real helpful. One of those is the Employee's Practical Guide to Requesting and Negotiating Reasonable Accommodation under the ADA. This is a guide that's designed for individuals with disabilities. We also have a separate one that's designed for employers, so when they have questions about these topics too. And it kind of goes through some of the basics of the ADA and some of those typical topics that individuals might have questions about. Then we also offer a how to request accommodation form. So this is sort of a how-to guide on how to write a request for accommodation or how to go about requesting accommodation. So these are great resources to have. You can access those at the end of the PowerPoint as well. Next slide. Excuse me. So when it comes to requesting accommodation, some things that you want to keep in mind. There's no requirement to mention ADA or to use the term reasonable accommodation when you're making a request. The law doesn't require this, but we do recommend it. So it's a good idea to keep it in mind that you want an employer to know exactly where you're coming from. You want them to know that you're leveraging rights under the ADA and that you're asking for an accommodation for that change at work. So use those terms that make sense and that will sort of trigger that for the employer. There's no requirement to make a request for accommodation in writing, but again, it is recommended. So it's always a good idea to have some sort of documentation about what you're requesting and why. It's a chance for you to make it really clear what you're asking of the employer, why you're asking for it, and to keep a record of it. So you don't ever want to come back and say that you've requested accommodation and there's no evidence of that. So doing it in writing is always a good idea. Just an email, for example. There's no requirement to request an accommodation at a particular time. So the key here is that you request an accommodation when the need becomes apparent to you. So if you know that you're going to need an accommodation, then you want to go about letting the employer know, again, before performance suffers, before a conduct rule is violated, things like that. So understand it as something that is there to enable you to be the best that you can be at work. So request it, as soon as you know you need it. You can request that accommodation, as I mentioned, through somebody who's going to act on that request. So the law doesn't really lay out any specific parameters regarding who it must go through, but we know that it should be somebody who can act on that request for you. So keep that in mind. So an appropriate person in your place of work. Next slide. Some things to remember when you are requesting accommodation. These are some things that you might want to include in an accommodation request letter. And that letter that I mentioned earlier that had a request accommodation just talk about these things as well. But basically, you want to start by identifying as having a disability, as having a medical condition, as having an impairment that is affecting your ability to perform the job duties or to access that benefit or privilege. So you're saying that you're doing this, you're asking for this change for a disability related reason, because that then triggers the interactive process, that requirement to work with you under the ADA. You want to mention the ADA or the need for accommodation, as I mentioned, because then it's clear to the employer that you're asking for something under the law. It's important to identify specific disability related limitations that you have. So if you're having difficulty with concentration, if you have difficulty seeing, standing, sitting, things like that, you want to be able to explain that to the employer. And it's also important to identify the job tasks that are affected. So, don't just tell the employer, I'm having trouble doing my job. Explain what it is you're having difficulty doing so you can really get right down to work figuring out those solutions so that the employer can work with you to get those accommodations in place so you can not have those performance issues. If you know accommodations that you think might be useful, go ahead and suggest them, but know that that's not sort of the end all be all, that you can work together with the employer, ask for their ideas as far as accommodations, contact Jan to see if we have any ideas for you. So it's something where you want to start by saying, I need an accommodation and offering ideas that you might have, but it then begins a process of sort of negotiating and exploring accommodations. You can attach medical documentation if you want to your initial request for accommodation. I usually suggest that be done later. So, it's not required that you do that. I would say that wait and see what the employer wants, because sometimes employers will ask for medical documentation and sometimes they won't. So maybe just wait and see, what makes sense, after you've made the request for accommodation, and decide what information to share at that point. I think it's helpful too to ask the employer to respond to your accommodation request within a reasonable time frame. There is no duty under the law for them to respond within a specific time frame, but I think it can be useful to ask them as a courtesy to please respond within a certain time frame. They might not stick to that, but there's no harm in getting that out there and kind of encouraging them to do so. Next slide. So when it comes to medical inquiries, it's a tricky area. When the impairment and the need for accommodation aren't known or obvious, as I mentioned earlier, the employer can request documentation that verifies certain things. So what they're trying to figure out is, do you have an impairment? So is there a learning disability, a seizure disorder, a mental health condition that the employer wouldn't know in an obvious way? They do need to know that the impairment affects a major life activity of some kind. I call these the ING words. So activities like reading, concentrating, interacting with others, standing, sitting. So think of those sort of those verbs that, those ING words, those activities that you do every day. And also that the impairment substantially limits the major life activity in some way. Now, I will say that with the ADA Amendments Act, that's interpreted a little bit broadly. It's not really something that has to be too substantially limiting. And I think even actually under the FEHA statute, the standard is even lower than the ADA in terms of how affected the individual is. So that isn't too important, but it's important to establish the impairment and the limitations, and then let the employer figure it out from there as to whether or not you meet the definition of disability under the ADA. Next slide. So here's another situation solution. Alex is working at a hospital coordinating the volunteer program. Alex uses a wheelchair. The facility is accessible and Alex can access their workstation. So initially in this situation, the person has an apparent disability. They don't need any particular accommodations right now. So generally, Alex wouldn't have any reason to discuss their disability with the employer because there's no need. However, let's kind of look at this a little bit further. The Alex maybe needs to attend a training at a different facility owned by the employer. So Alex now needs to make sure, or needs to know, that that facility is accessible to them when they go to take that training. So in that situation, Alex might need to request accommodation because perhaps the training facility isn't accessible. And in this case, it looks as though Alex might need accessible parking. So in this case, generally, everyday employment type situation, Alex doesn't have any need to disclose or talk about their disability. But when certain circumstances come up, that could change. So in this case, Alex might need to request a designated accessible parking space to attend the training at that other facility. So sometimes accommodation needs can change over time, and the need to share information can change. Next slide. So some basic principles around reasonable accommodation. These are basic principles that apply to employers. They're just good to keep in mind. That the employer is not required to provide accommodation unless it's needed for a disability-related reason. That they're not required to provide accommodations that, again, pose an undue hardship. So that might cause significant difficulty or expense in some way. That they can also choose among effective accommodation solutions. So remember that if we have two reasonable accommodations and both would be effective and the employer prefers one over the other, the employer could technically choose whichever accommodation they prefer to provide. But we know it's also important for them to consider an individual's preference when doing that. So if you know that there's a reason why one accommodation, though both might be effective, is preferred by you over the other, then let the employer know that. Give them some reasons why. So help them be educated on why that's more important in terms of a better accommodation, perhaps. Employers aren't required to provide personal use items needed in accomplishing daily activities both on and off the job. So again, these are things like prescribed items like a hearing aid or a wheelchair, for example, medications, things that an individual might need to use both on and off the job. They're also not required to accommodate an individual who is not otherwise qualified for the position. So this is really important. Remember that the ADA is a law that requires employers to not discriminate against a qualified individual with a disability, to provide reasonable accommodations to a qualified individual with a disability. That means you must be somebody who's able to be considered qualified for the job. So can you perform the essential duties with or without accommodation at the end of the day? If you are not able to do that, then you are not a qualified person. So that means that an employer doesn't have to retain somebody who is not otherwise qualified for the job. Also, they're not required to remove essential functions, create new jobs, lower production standards. So those things that I mentioned earlier that would not be considered reasonable as an accommodation. But again, an employer could certainly do that. So they can always go above and beyond. What I typically tell people is don't make the decision whether the employer has to do something or not. If you know you need something, go ahead and ask for it and see what happens. You might find that the employer is quite open to it. So don't cancel things out just because you think it's not possible or that you think it might not be reasonable under the law. Sometimes employers are just willing to go above and beyond. Next slide. So some basic principles that you may want to keep in mind for individuals with disabilities, that you may request an accommodation at any time. So there's not a rule that says you have to request an accommodation the day that you're hired. It really is about knowing what makes sense for you. So at what point do you know you need an accommodation? But again, best before performance suffers, right? So you don't want to end up in that situation where you're being terminated and you didn't share information about your disability or request an accommodation that could have prevented you from being terminated because it could have helped you meet the performance standards. You're not required to mention ADA or reasonable accommodation when you're making that request, or to make that request in writing, but a written request is recommended. So always keep that in mind. You can be expected to provide documentation to substantiate your disability and your need for accommodation. How much information will depend on what the employer needs and also on any state law requirements that might bar them from asking for too much. Also, another party may request accommodation on someone's behalf. So sometimes there might be a situation where someone might not either recognize the need for accommodation, or somebody might just simply have someone who acts as an advocate for them who can go about making that request for them. Or the request might actually just come through documentation provided by a healthcare provider because the person has some limitations or restrictions. So accommodations can come in different ways. Also, there's no specific time frame for an employer to respond to a request for accommodation, but they should respond expeditiously. What that basically just means is that they should respond without delay. So there's no specific time frame, but it means it should happen, fairly quickly. And it's always a good idea that if you haven't heard back from the employer, check back in with them. So don't let it go too long before you don't have a response from them. If you made a request, maybe the following week, check back in with them, or the following week after, just to kind of see what the status is of that accommodation request. Next slide. So sometimes when you've made an accommodation request, you don't know what accommodations are needed, and that's okay. Again, remember, it's about sort of initiating that process. So it's okay to say, I'm not sure what accommodations I need, but I know these are the limitations I'm experiencing in performing certain job duties. Can we talk about it? Let's work together and work collaboratively to engage in an interactive process and explore accommodation solutions. That's where Jan can be of help to you. So, maybe you're not sure exactly what to do, but you know what job duties need to be performed and you know what trouble you're having. So Jan can be of assistance with that. So whether you're an individual with a disability who wants some help with that, whether you're a rehab provider that needs help with that, or service provider, or if you're an employer working with an individual with a disability, anyone can contact us to get some help with that. And a good place to start is askjan.org. Next slide. So let's say you've gone through this interactive process, you've requested accommodations, and let's say the employer comes back and says, no, we can't provide the accommodation you've requested, and they deny it. Well, don't just let it stop there. I think it's important to ask why. Come back to the table, ask for some information about why the accommodation was denied. Maybe it's for very simple reasons. Maybe just the employer didn't think the accommodations were reasonable, or maybe they didn't have enough information. So get some more information about why that denial was issued. If they need more information, provide it as quickly as possible. So if it was that they didn't have the medical information they needed, or they didn't understand your limitations, try to really collaborate with the employer to get them what they need. If it was the accommodations weren't reasonable, offer some alternative solutions. So again, come back to that table and explore some additional possibilities that might work. You can go through an internal appeal process if one's available to you. So some employers will allow the possibility of appealing an accommodation request. And if that doesn't work, or you've done it and it wasn't effective, you could look at an internal complaint option with the employer. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you've done everything you think you can do, you certainly do have the right to file a complaint. From an ADA standpoint, you would do that with the EEOC. I will tell you that for those people in California, I say go directly to your Fair Employment Practices Agency, because the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing can help you. I say that particularly because I know California is a state where the state statute's a bit more progressive than ADA even. So I would ordinarily say go straight to DFEH for that. Next slide. So the big takeaways in this last segment, what is a job accommodation? So simply think of it as a different way of getting the job done when a disability causes some limitations in doing the work. It's an adjustment made during the hiring process to the work environment, or in the way that the job duties are performed, or to access a benefit or privilege in some way. There are lots of different types of accommodations. There's no comprehensive list. And so I say to people, ask for what you think you need and let's see what happens from there. It could be things like a flexible schedule or our screen magnification software. It could be asking for things like written instructions or meeting with an employer or manager more frequently so that you know that you're meeting your job goals, things like that. So it could be a service of some kind. It could be a service animal. So lots of things to consider. So you want to sort of be creative and think about solutions. That's really what it's all about. Next slide. All right, here's another situation. James has applied for a job as a pet groomer. He has autism spectrum disorder and finds that receiving a list of questions before an interview helps him focus and respond more effectively. So what James decided to do was go ahead and several days prior to the interview, request that the employer share a list of potential questions in advance of that interview. In that situation, an employer is generally going to ask why, and that's what we have here, because they want to understand why someone would want those questions ahead of time. I mean, everyone would like interview questions ahead of time. But in some situations, it's an accommodation. It's something that someone might need because of the disability. So in that case, James would need to disclose their disability in order to receive that type of accommodation. In this case, the employer is willing to offer some questions, but not to state specifically which questions would be asked during the interview. So that's a way to accommodate somebody in that situation. Next slide. Okay, so there are a lot of resources available to you through Jan and other very helpful resources as well. So in this PowerPoint, I have included some relevant resources related to disability disclosure. Jan offers several on our website. In particular, we have an A to Z topic section that talks about disability disclosure issues. Within that, we've recently released a module around disability disclosure and a video that sort of demonstrates a situation where somebody needed to disclose their disability at work to receive accommodation. So that might be helpful. That's something that you can access anytime. It's on our YouTube channel, and you can also access it through the Jan website. Next slide. There are also resources related to the ADA. So one in particular, job applicants and the ADA is an EEOC resource that's very helpful. Then also, of course, your rights as an individual with a disability. And I mentioned the definition of disability earlier, so I wanted to make sure you have some more information about figuring that out. One thing to note there is that you don't have to get bogged down thinking about whether you have a disability defined under the ADA. Like I said, if you have a medical condition that you know is affecting your ability to do the job, go ahead and talk to the employer about it, because ultimately they really need to figure out legally whether it's a disability. So you don't have to make that determination. Next slide. Requesting accommodations, so resources related to that. The askjan.org site, tons of resources all throughout the site. Just a few that you can keep in mind is that employee's practical guide that I mentioned, how to request an accommodation, which is that form letter that can help you write your own request. And then there's a section of the site that's just devoted to some resources specifically to individuals with disabilities. If you're a rehab provider or service provider, there's a section related to that too. And if you're an employer, there's a section related to that too. So we really try to make sure we kind of address everybody's needs, but the site is just extensive. So lots to look for there. Next slide. So when it comes to accessing the Jan service, which I encourage you all to do, there are lots of ways to do that. Right now, probably the fastest way to get in touch with us is to use the live chat feature on our askjan.org homepage. So you can go there and the live chat's on the right-hand side. You can also submit an inquiry via email. We have two ways to do that. We have a Jan on Demand section of our site where you can fill out a form that gives us all the information we need in order to help you best. Or you could just submit a simple email question to jan@askjan.org. You can also call the service and leave a message, and someone will get back in touch with you, usually via email as a start to set up a time to talk with you. So that's another way. And then, of course, you can connect with us on social media as well. I think that is about everything that I wanted to talk about. Yeah, so again, so here's the contact information once again. If you have a chance, take a look around the sites and see if you can find what you need. And if you don't, definitely reach out to us and we can help. So hopefully that was useful information. It was a lot of information, but hopefully it's something that you can take away from here and consider asking for accommodations at work and knowing what your rights are under the ADA as a start. So with that, Jessica, I'm going to hand it back over to you and your team to see if we have any questions.
See if I can figure out how to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Tracy. That was incredibly informative. I don't know about everyone on the call, but I have listened to many different Jan presentations, and every single time I listened to one, I learned something new. So I was very excited about this. So we do have several questions in the chat. I did want to let everyone know that it is almost 2 o'clock. So if you do have to jump off the call, please feel free to do so. We're going to go ahead and continue with questions. I am going to stop the recording for questions, and I apologize for starting the recording late. That was
okay.
on me. Probably a little bit jarring. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then I think that Spencer and Kathy are going to start with the questions that were in the chat, and then potentially we could open it up to people who might want to ask a live question.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. And thank